Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to part 2 of the Siege of Vraks. In the first episode, we looked at how the impregnable fortress world of Vraks fell to the great enemy in the first place. And in this case, it turns out that even the mightiest of fortifications have little in the way of defenses against an enemy from within. At the very least, an enemy as powerful as Cardinal Zaphon. But with the capture of Vraks, on one hand, a massive success and complete triumph for Cardinal Zaphon, but on the other hand, also one that puts him squarely in the spotlight of the Imperium. He was no longer merely suspected by the Inquisition. As far as they were concerned, he had shown his true colors. And all that remained now was to see how the Imperium was going to respond to his actions. And as it turned out, said response was going to be quite slow. It took several weeks before the Administratum even noticed that the planet had fallen in the first place. It may sound ridiculous, but in an Imperium consisting of hundreds of thousands, if not millions upon millions of worlds, the fall of one planet, even one of such relative importance as Vraks, hardly creates that much of a ripple in the Imperium's vast pond. And it's also very important to point out that it was far from guaranteed that the Imperium would even try to take the world back. In the grand scheme of things, Vraks and its population of some 8 million souls was barely a blip on the radar. The important part was the weapons stored on the planet. The potential consequences of Imperial Guard regiments throughout the Skara sector being rendered combat ineffective due to a lack of supplies were considerably harder to overlook than the loss of the planet itself and its population. It was, of course, also the case that this was not necessarily an anti-imperial uprising. It is rare, but on occasion a local revolt might overthrow their overlords. Let's, for example, say that a planet is suffering beneath a particularly brutal and oppressive local regime. The population might rise up and overthrow the local ruling class. And as long as this insurrection has no negative impact upon the planet's commitments to the wider Imperium, it may simply be ignored. As long as the Imperium receives its tithes and the planet remains true to its obligations to the Imperium, then it might very well simply be better to live and let live. No harm, no foul. And at first glance, it would appear as if Vraks certainly fulfilled some of those conditions. The revolt had been a spontaneous happenstance. It had been caused more by the Inquisition than, honestly, the Cardinal. And that, of course, was another thing. The revolt was not led by some backwater warlord or insurrectionist, but rather by an anointed member of the imperial cult, a cardinal, no less. And it wasn't even started on his command. One would think that these would be extenuating circumstances. However, there was one very big problem that put all of this well beyond the realm of simply live and let live. Namely the fact that the Cardinal had been spewing some rather aggressive rhetoric. He had for several years now been announcing that he was to lead a great crusade to sweep sin away from the Skara sector, an imperial sector. Now, if he'd been announcing a crusade on a neighboring sector, one filled with chaos deviants or filthy xenos, that might have been something else. But the situation as it stood right now was that a firebrand cardinal, who had essentially been preaching holy war on his own sector, was now not only in possession of an army of zealous followers, but also a nearly infinite supply of weapons, armor, vehicles, tanks, aircrafts, artillery, and anything else he might wish to equip them with. There was also the matter of the assassination attempt. If news of that got out, and the Cardinal was not punished, then not only would that send a message that he was outside of the Inquisition's justice, it might also be used as a tool by the Cardinal to increase his fame and spread his word to even more zealous followers. he could quite literally flaunt the fact that he had escaped the Inquisition's justice. He was beyond their justice, in fact, because he was only beholden to the Emperor's justice, not some false inquisitorial organization that functioned only at the behest of the clerks and shopkeepers of the vile Adeptus Administratum. This would unavoidably increase the Cardinal's influence quite considerably, to the point that even if he were to be removed at a later date, the damage would almost certainly have been done, as the Cardinal's followers would have increased in numbers drastically and spread to dozens of other worlds within the Scaris sector. Once they received word of his death, they would almost certainly come to the conclusion that he had been assassinated, and thusly the revolt that had taken place on Vraks and ended with the overthrow of the world would then take place on dozens of other worlds. This insurrection could simply not be ignored. Vraks would have to be retaken, and it would have to happen on the ground. The deployment of planet-cracking ordnance was briefly considered and then rejected. The weapons and vehicles stored on Vraks were enough to supply an entire subsector. The planet was one thing, but the weapons, those were far too valuable to simply destroy. Orbital bombardment, as well as the deployment of chemical or biological weapons of exterminatus grade, were also considered and rejected. The full extent of the Vraxian capital was protected by multiple overlapping void shields, along with orbital defense silos, both torpedo and laser batteries. The defenses could be cracked, but it would require the deployment of far too great of a force, and cost far too many ships to be considered a practical solution. Similarly, the deployment of, for example, the Life Eater virus, which would scrub the planet clean of even the most minuscule trace of biological life that might be found on the barren rock, was considered, and again, rejected. It would do little to the defenders in their sealed and hardened defenses. It would, however, immensely inconvenience any follow-up ground invasion, as most, if not all, of the planet's water would be boiled away, and any hopes of feeding the troops locally by the creation of algae farms, one of the few things capable of living on Vraks, would also be gone. The simple truth of the matter was that Vraks had been designed to resist just the kind of invasion the Imperium was now contemplating. But that was now the problem of the Lord Commander Obscurus. The Administratum had made their decision and signed the necessary documents. They had washed their hands, and it was now up to the commanders on the ground to find the necessary men to pay the price that Vraks would so surely demand. This sparked yet another round of discussion by the military command of the Obscurus sector as to how precisely this was to be done, as they undoubtedly wondered to themselves for about the 100th time if those murderously incompetent desk humpers back on Terra had even the faintest hint of a clue as to what it was they were asking of them. Many senior officers even went to the length of suggesting that the order might be refused, or at the very least questioned, or possibly even buried in so much paperwork that even the Administratum would eventually give up and forget all about it. They postulated that the cost in men and materials required to recapture the stores on Vraks would at best break even, and in all due likelihood prove to be a net loss. In their view, the Administratum had already evicted the contents of their reprehensibly odious assholes all over the carpet, and it was all a bit too late to try and shove the repugnant mess back up the rear entry fundament of whichever worthless Administratum drone was responsible. The only thing that would result in, they stated, was a lot of wasted time and a lot of broken broom handles. Naturally, the Lord Commander took these opinions under consideration for a whole 7 seconds before informing his subordinates that they were welcome to go bitch and whine to their favorite officer's mattress on their own damn time, but as long as their clearly over-decorated torsos were hanging about in his command center, they would recognize the fact that they were commanding officers of the Imperial Guard, and served the God Emperor of Mankind, who in this particular occasion had handed them a most holy mission that just so happened to take the form of a data wafer with the High Lords of the Administratum's signature on it. Finally, if any amongst them still held misgivings about the sanctity, and indeed the necessity of the mission, the Lord Commander would be more than pleased to round up the usual 6 guardsmen and help the doubting officer in question bring his misgivings directly to the God Emperor. Did I mention, by the way, that the Lord Commander was Cadian, and that Cadians are quite fond of interpreting orders rather literally? No? Well, now you know. To be clear, though, even the Lord Commander didn't have much hope in this endeavor ending in anything but vast quantities of mangled corpses, but he had been given an order, and in the Imperial Guard you do not question orders, at the very least not if you know what is best for your long-term health prospects. So with that settled, the question remained how to go about planning an attack on a world designed from its very inception to be impervious to attack. Since the more extreme options had already been considered and rejected by those higher up the food chain, the Lord Commander was left to ponder the more conventional options. Luckily, Vraks being an Imperial world and all, or, well, used to at least, the Imperium had access to pretty much any and all information they wanted on its defenses. Considerably less fortuitous was the sheer size of the folder created once all of these defenses were listed and compiled. The first and most obvious option to get around said defenses was simply to not engage them at all. A lightning strike from orbit directly onto the central spaceport would avoid the majority of the ground defenses, and at the end of the day, those defenses were Vraks' primary strength. The PDF, even if it was substantially strengthened by zealots and by breaking open the armories, would only number a couple of million at most, and the majority of those troops would be fairly poorly trained and led. It stood to reason then that if a hammer blow could be delivered swiftly, by the deployment of Adeptus Astartes forces straight to the enemy's central nervous system and command structure, their resistance could be shattered quickly. Imperial Guard elements would then follow in the Space Marine's wake of destruction and strike directly towards the main citadel, thusly cutting off the head of the proverbial serpent. This would leave the remainder of the planet's PDF defenses entrenched relatively safely within their defenses, but without leadership or access to the various resources and supplies of the main citadel, they could simply be ignored until they eventually, and inevitably, wilted on the vine. It wasn't all perfect, however. The plan had some pretty severe risks attached to it. If the force was unable to quickly break through the starport guards, or they were unable to bring in sufficient reinforcements, the invasion force could easily find itself surrounded and eventually destroyed. But in all due reality, if led by the Astartes and supported by Tempestus stormtroopers, such an assault had a relatively slim chance of failure. There was, however, one considerably larger problem, namely that this was by far the most obvious approach. And so Vraks had been built with it in mind from the very beginning. As many as 100 orbital defense lasers ringed the citadel and starport. These guns were organized into massive batteries and buried deep underground in reinforced bunkers. Even the mighty Battlefleet Solar would consider Vraks a tough nut to crack from orbit, and without first neutralizing the defense batteries, any invasion force was sure to be met with murderous casualties. And that would be before they even reached the low-level anti-air artillery, much less the ground itself. The casualty rates of such a drop were estimated to be somewhere in the vicinity of 96%. And even the God Emperor's avenging angels, well used to long odds, would consider those to be little more than suicide. And without the Astartes, the all-important tip of the spear, the hammer in the hammer blow, it was extremely unlikely that whatever small force made it down to the surface would be able to take the starport, much less the citadel itself. Tempting as it was to try for a quick resolution to the conflict, the low odds on offer made such an attempt foolhardy at best. However, a variation of the plan was suggested. The general idea was still the same. The planet was to be taken by a single, massive strike, straight to the starport. but rather than being the initial action of the campaign, it would come at the very end of a long campaign of strategic destruction. Firstly, the Imperial Navy would be deployed in strength to blockade the system. Blockading Vraks itself should be an easy task, as it had no real fleet, but it was expected that a significant force would be needed to make sure that no outside forces intervened. And considering that the potential prize for such an intervention was an entire planet's worth of weapons and armor, the Navy force would have to be considerable indeed to act as a sufficient deterrent. Once the blockade was in place, the second phase of the operation would begin. This was the part that was going to take a very long time indeed. 100 years, by the more optimistic estimates. Over the course of the following century, repeated large-scale raids by elite forces would be launched upon the planet, aiming to pick away at its defenses, one strong point at a time. The eventual goal of each succession of raids was to leave one of the planetary laser bunkers vulnerable to attack, and then destroy it, with the eventual aim of the campaign being to neutralize all, or at least the vast majority, of Vraks' anti-orbital weapons. And only then could the third and final phase, the actual attack on the starport itself, be launched. All in all, it was a relatively safe strategy. As long as the Imperium retained full void dominance, they could rapidly deploy their raiding forces wherever they wanted. The defenders would have to defend the entire length of their frontage, whilst the Imperials could deploy all of their troops against one sector at a time. Even if they ran into the occasional setback, the overwhelming local advantage caused by such a strategy would surely see the Imperials victorious in most of their engagements. It was also suggested that perhaps the planet could be forced into submission through the blockade alone. But one quick glance at the sheer volume of ready-to-eat rations packs stored on Vraks, along with the planet's water reserves and potential algae farms, quickly dispelled any such hope. However, the first plan was sound. The problem was the schedule. 100 years. 100 years of maintaining a blockade, tying up valuable shipping. 100 years tying up Imperial Guard regiments, Tempestus stormtroopers, and possibly even Adeptus Astartes. 100 years of supplying and reinforcing said regiments, and finally 100 years of the heretics looting Vraks' stores, the very things they were supposed to be reclaiming. The plan was finally rejected as far too timid, and whilst it was likely to succeed, the fruits of any eventually guaranteed victory compared to the costs expended to gain it were deemed to be insufficient. Very well. The third and final option, then, was a conventional siege. In this scenario, vast Imperial Guard forces would be brought down to the planet, then subsequently entrenched around the Citadel and its concentric defensive rings. Those entrenchments would then be used as basis of operation, and the enemy defenses would be hammered into the Vraksian soil by a combination of mass assault and artillery barrages. The logic behind it all was simple, if cold, and somewhat brutal. If the battle became one of attrition, then the Imperium, with its vastly superior, near-limitless resources, both in manpowers, vehicles, artillery, and ammunition, could not possibly fail to obtain victory. But at what price? A lengthy siege by a large number of Imperial Guard regiments that would necessarily have to be involved in heavy and sustained fighting would naturally result in a fair bit of losses. But that inevitability might also be used in the Imperium's favor. Assuming the Administratum was willing to allocate enough men and resources, and assuming a casualty ratio of 2 to 3 guardsmen for every traitor, with the traitors' numbers of course being a known quantity, or at least so they thought, calculations show that the war would last an approximate 12 Terran years, and cost between 2 to 6 million guardsmen. Now, finally, we were getting somewhere. 12 years was considered to be an acceptable timeline, and the cost in human lives was also considered to be a more than worthwhile bargain to regain control of the massive supply depots located in and under the Citadel. The wheels of the Administratum began to turn. Millions upon millions of men would need to be found, armed, clothed, fed, trained, and transported. Millions of las rifles would need producing, millions more of power packs, vox speeds, helmets, bayonets, and all the miscellaneous trappings of an Imperial soldier. Not to mention the weapons required to break the fortifications. Thousands of guns and millions of shells were merely the first entries on a mile-long list of necessities. But first things first. The undertaking required a name and a leader. The former was to be the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, and the latter role fell to Lord Commander Julka. A somewhat confusing choice, but then on the other hand, an eminently predictable one as well. The Lord Commander did not have much in the way of military experience, at least not beyond the plush and comfortable surroundings of his upspire estate at the hands of his private tutors from the Imperial Academy. What he did have, though, was a prestigious name and a proud military heritage. His great-grandfather had even served as an attaché to the Lord Solar on Terra. He needed a first posting, and for the sake of his further career, it needed to be a victory. And statistically speaking, Vraks was as good as a done deal. The Administratum had committed to providing the necessary men and material. Subsequently, all that needed doing was to keep the attrition in accordance with the 12-year time plan. In sharp contrast to the reality for the humble guardsman, the lot of a Lord Commander on Vraks was an easy one. And considering the static nature of the engagement, he barely even had to do any planning. It was a nice, cushy job for a nice, cushy man. But whilst the overall commander was potentially somewhat lacking, the choice of meat for the grinder was not. The choice fell upon the famous Death Corps of Krieg. If you haven't already, I strongly recommend pausing this video and taking a look at the Death Corps of Krieg video, as it goes into depth as to the history and the organization of both the Death Corps, and another video on the Vraxian Defenders. Now, whatever the Lord Commander's shortcomings might be, he was at least an adequate administrator. He organized a large staff around himself and set about the task of setting his armies into order, and eventually preparing them for transportation. The Administratum did most of the heavy logistical lifting, but how, when, and who to move and to where was up to the Lord Commander's headquarters, which incidentally was placed upon the planet Thracian Primaris, a comfortable distance away from Vraks itself, but at least in the same system. After all, there was no real reason for the Lord Commander to inconvenience himself. The war was already as good as won. All he had to do was to make sure that the casualties were kept up, preferably on both sides, and that fresh blood continued to flow into the besieging army. And speaking of said army, Krieg, as always, stood ready to deliver whatever the God Emperor might wish for, and the men and material to transform the 88th Siege Army from a paper formation into a fully fledged conquering force was swiftly provided. Transportation and logistical supply would be handled by the Imperial Navy, and with the establishment of a general headquarters on Thracian Primaris, the pieces all began falling into place. And so, with the final delivery of the Lord Commander's favourite feathered couch and a fully stocked bar cabinet, the reconquest of Vraks could begin. And I am sure that the Lord Commander's men took great comfort in knowing that his lordship's generously upholstered backside would be eminently comfortable, and not suffer too much in the way of deprivations as the harsh realities of war began to sink in. As for the men who had the simple task of dying in acceptable proportions to the enemy, they were even now on their way down to the planet's surface. Massive Imperial Guard landing ships would deploy entire regiments at a time, as they swiftly set about fortifying several landing zones around the Vraxian capital. The fear was that the Cardinal would launch a large-scale riposte as the Krieg forces were landing and at their most vulnerable, seeking to destroy the invasion force piecemeal as they were ferried down. Death Rider companies were amongst the first to arrive and swiftly galloped out into the surrounding landscape to warn of just such an attempt. But as the hours and then days began to pass, it seemed as if the defenders were fully content to stay within their fortified bunkers, and let the Imperials deploy in peace. But why would he do so? On one hand, the landings were a golden opportunity for the rebels to potentially inflict serious losses on the would-be besiegers, as they would have been caught in the open with minimal in the way of defenses and little room to maneuver, as well as being unable to bring to bear their full numerical might. But in reality, despite the damage that such a thrust could have caused, the Cardinal had no way of knowing the composition of the Imperium's response force. For all he knew, the moment his forces set themselves in motion and cleared their own defenses, drop pods filled with Astartes warriors could start hammering into his marching lines. In such an eventuality, the war on Vraks would have been short-lived indeed. No, it is much safer to simply hunker down in prepared positions and wait for the enemy to fully show their hand. Though it would certainly take quite a while to see the full extent of the Imperium's commitment. The Lord Commander was understandably a bit paranoid that such a prize as Vraks might already have attracted unwanted attention, and the transport crafts were heavily escorted by the Imperial Navy. Once on the surface, the Death Corps began their preparations aided by a Munitorium labor corps of some 500,000 penal workers, whose primary job was to construct a vast network of railway lines that would run the length of the rear supply lines and the improvised starports. The Mechanicus arrived shortly thereafter with several armoured mass locomotion trains, gargantuan engines capable of transporting entire regiments along with all their heavy equipments to the front line. Once the men of Krieg were in place, the engines would be used to haul the vast quantities of ammunition, food, water, spare parts, building materials, fuel, etc., 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 and all of the other myriad things the 88th Siege Army would need to function through the long years of the siege. It took a full year to get everything in place and ready to begin offensive operations. During this year, virtually no hostile actions were taken by either sides. The most aggressive that they got was the occasional ranging shot and perhaps a quick harassing barrage here and there. In the case of the Imperials, this was due to the simple fact that there was little point in going off half-cocked. The timetable had been set in stone before the first man even set foot on Vraks, and it allowed for a generous period of preparations. As for the Cardinal's forces, having lost the chance of a quick attack on the landing zones, any offensive moves at this point would simply serve to expose the defenders to the Krieg trench lines. It is also possible that the Cardinal thought that just maybe there was still a hope of negotiation, but if he made any official overtures, then they were all ignored both by the besiegers and any chroniclers present. The Imperium had made its reply. It would be war, and Vraks was to be retaken. On the other hand, the Cardinal had also made his determination clear. At the very least, he intended to bleed the Imperium for a period of time until perhaps negotiations could be resumed. One should, however, also take into consideration that it is entirely possible that the Cardinal had fallen for his own propaganda, and was entirely convinced that once the Imperial intervention force was destroyed, he would lead a grand crusade out from Vraks to cleanse the sector of the heretics, the ne'er-do-wells, and any others that would stand in his way. Very little is really known about the Cardinal's mindset at the time, since, well, Imperial chroniclers do not tend to dedicate all that much time to understanding their enemy. Next episode, we're going to have a look at the makeup of the 88th Siege Army, and how they're going to initiate battle on Vraks. Then, immediately after that, we're going to move on to the first proper combat operations against the Renegade Cardinal. Until then, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. And if you liked the video, please do consider leaving a like and sharing it around with your friends. Have a good day.